Book 7, 52 BC. Vercingetorix, the beginning of the war. On reaching Italy, I heard the news of the assassination of Clodius, and was told of the decree of the Senate ordering the swearing in of all Italians of military age. I therefore proceeded to conscript recruits in all parts of my province. These events were quickly reported in Transalpine Gaul, where the Gauls themselves invented some additions to the story which seemed to fit in with the facts. They declared that I was being detained in northern Italy because of the troubles in Rome, and that, in view of the very disturbed situation there, I was unable to rejoin the army. To those who had long been indignant at finding themselves under Roman sovereignty, this seemed an opportunity to be grasped, and they began more openly, and with greater daring, to make plans for war. Meetings of Gallic chieftains were arranged in remote places among the forests, and at these meetings there were bitter protests about the death of Acco. They themselves, it was pointed out, might easily meet with the same fate, and they lamented the general condition of the whole country, offering all sorts of reward to any persons who would take the initiative in starting a war and risk their own lives in the cause of the freedom of Gaul. The first thing to be done, they said, was to find some way of cutting me off from my army before their secret plans could become known. And this, they thought, should not be difficult, since the legions would not venture to leave their winter camps in the absence of the commander-in-chief, and I would not be able to reach the legions unless I had a strong escort with me. And in any case, they said, it was better to die in battle than to fail to recover their ancient glory in war and the liberty which they had inherited from their ancestors. As a result of this agitation, the Carnutes came forward and said that they were willing to face any danger for the common cause, and that they would strike the first blow in the war. Under present conditions, it was not possible to give pledges of good faith by exchanging hostages. To do so would have the effect of making their plans public. So the Carnutes asked the others to bring together all their war standards, according to Gallic tradition, a most solemn ceremony, and in front of them to swear an oath of honor not to desert them when once war had begun. All present praised the Carnutes for what they had said, and took the required oath. Then, after a date had been fixed for the beginning of the revolt, they left the assembly. When the appointed day came, the Carnutes, led by two thoroughly abandoned characters called Catuatus and Conconotodomnus, at a given signal made a sudden descent on Cinabum, where they massacred all Roman citizens who had settled there as traders, and plundered their property. Among those killed was Gaius Fufius Caeta, a distinguished Roman knight whom I had put in charge of the grain supply. The news spread quickly through all the states of Gaul. In fact, when anything happens in Gaul that is particularly important or remarkable, the people shout out the news from one to another across the whole extent of the country. Each takes up the report in turn and passes it on to his nearest neighbor. So it happened in this case. What had taken place in Cinabum at dawn was known before 8 p.m. in the country of the Arverni, about 150 miles away. There the initiative was taken by Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian with very great influence among his people. His father, Celtillus, had once been the leading man in the whole of Gaul, and had been murdered by his subjects because he wanted to go still further and make himself king. Now Vercingetorix called together his own dependents, and easily aroused their enthusiasm for the cause. When his plans became known, people came in arms to join him from all sides. His uncle, Gobernitio, and the rest of the tribal chiefs, who were against taking the risks involved, tried to restrain him, and in fact expelled him from the town of Gergovia. However, he did not give up, but proceeded to recruit all sorts of beggars and outcasts in the country districts. With these bands to support him, he brought over to his side all the Arvernians whom he approached. Calling upon his countrymen to take up arms in the cause of the liberty of Gaul, he soon got together large forces and drove out of the state those appointments of his who had just expelled him. He was proclaimed king by his followers. Deputations were sent out in every direction, urging other tribes to stand by him, and in a very short time he had acquired the support of the Senones, Parisi, Pictones, Carduci, Turoni, Aulerci, Limovices, Andes, and all the other tribes on the coast. By general consent he was given the supreme command. With this power in his hands, Vercingetorix demanded hostages from all the above-mentioned states, ordered each of them to send to him at once a fixed number of troops, and assigned the quantity of arms which had to be got ready in each state before a certain time. He paid particular attention to his cavalry. He combined very great efficiency with extreme strictness of discipline, and the severity of his punishments had the effect of bringing over the waverers to his side. Serious crimes were punished by death at the stake, or under all kinds of torture. In the case of slighter offences, the criminal was sent home with his ears cut off or one eye gouged out to serve as a lesson to the rest, and to frighten them by examples of severity. By such savage means as these, he soon got an army together. He sent part of his forces under Lucterius, a Carducan, and a most intrepid commander, into the country of the Ruteni, while he himself marched against the Bituriges. On his approach, the Bituriges sent representatives to the Aedui, their protectors, asking for help in resisting the invasion. Acting on the advice of the generals whom I had left with the army, the Aedui sent a force of cavalry and infantry to the aid of the Bituriges. But when they reached the river Loire, which is the frontier between the Aedui and the Bituriges, they waited about for a few days, and then returned home without having ventured to cross the river. They told our generals that they had come back because they were afraid of treachery on the part of the Bituriges, who, according to their information, had planned, if they crossed the Loire, to attack them on one side while the Arverni attacked from the other. As I have no evidence for knowing whether this was the real reason for their action, or whether it was a question of treachery, I cannot make a definite statement on the subject. As soon as they left, the Bituriges immediately made common cause with the Arverni. I received news of these events while I was in Italy. By this time I knew that, thanks to the vigour shown by Pompey, the situation in Rome was becoming more satisfactory, and so I started for Transalpine Gaul. When I arrived, I was faced with the very difficult problem of how I was going to rejoin the army. I knew that if I were to tell the legions to come to me in the province, they would have to fight battles on the march without their commander-in-chief. The alternative was to hurry on to the legions myself, but I knew that it would be a mistake to entrust myself to any of the tribes on the way, even the ones which, at the moment, appeared harmless. Meanwhile, Lucterius the Cadurcan, who had been sent into the country of the Ruteni, had induced that tribe to join the Arverni. He went on into the country of the Nitiobriges and the Gabali, and took hostages from both. Then, with the large forces which he had got together, he swept on in the direction of Narbonne, with the intention of breaking into the province. I decided that I must leave all other considerations aside and go to Narbonne myself. When I arrived there, I did what I could to encourage the faint-hearted, posting garrisons among the Ruteni inside the province, the Volci, Arecomici, the Tolosetes, and around the city of Narbonne, in fact, all along the line nearest the enemy. I ordered part of the forces in the province and some fresh troops, which I had brought back from Italy, to concentrate in the country of the Helvi, which is on the Arvernian frontier. These measures had the effect of checking Lucterius and forcing him to retire, since he thought it too risky to bring his troops inside the line of our garrisons. I therefore set out for the country of the Helvi. It was the hardest time of the year, and on the Cevennes mountains, which separate the Helvi from the Arverni, the snow lay thick, blocking up all the roads. However, by shovelling away the snow to a depth of 6 feet, The soldiers cleared away, and, thanks to their toil and sweat, I was able to reach the country of the Arverni. I caught them entirely off their guard. They had imagined that behind the savannah they were as safe as if behind a wall. Never before at this time of the year had even single travellers managed to get across the passes. So I ordered the cavalry to range over as much of the country as they could, and spread as much terror as possible among the inhabitants. Rumours and definite reports of this soon reached Vercingetorix, and all his Arvernian followers came up to him in terror, begging him to think of their interests, and not to allow their property to be carried off by the enemy, especially since it appeared that the whole Roman war effort was now directed against them. Vercingetorix listened to their entreaties, and moved from the country of the Bituriges toward that of the Arverni. This was just what I had imagined he would do. So after staying there for only 2 days, I went off on the pretext of collecting cavalry and reinforcements. I left young Brutus in command of the troops, instructing him to overrun the country as far as possible in all directions, and I told him that I would try not to be away for longer than 3 days. Once this had been settled, I greatly surprised my own escort by hurrying off at full speed to VII. There I picked up a fresh contingent of cavalry, which I had sent on some time before, and without stopping by day or night went straight on through the country of the Aedui to that of the Lingones, where 2 of the legions were in their winter camps. It was possible, I thought, that the Aedui might actually have designs on my life, so I moved too fast for them. After reaching the winter camp, I sent messengers to the other legions, and had them all concentrated in one place before it was possible for the Arverni even to have heard that I had got there. When he did receive the news, Vercingetorix led his army back again into the country of the Bituriges, and went on from there to attack Gorgobina, a town of the Boii, whom I had settled there under Aeduan protection after their defeat in the battle I fought with the Helvetii. This move of Vercingetorix made it very difficult for me to decide what to do next. If I kept all the legions together for the rest of the winter, a people supposedly under Aeduan protection might be overpowered, and all the rest of Gaul, thinking that I was incapable of bringing help to my friends, might join in the revolt. On the other hand, if I led the army out of winter quarters too early in the year, difficulties of transport might give us serious trouble with regard to our grain supply. However, it seemed to me better to undergo every sort of difficulty rather than to suffer a loss of prestige, and consequently lose the goodwill of all my supporters. I therefore told the Aedui that I relied on them to bring up supplies, and I sent to the Boii to inform them that I was coming, and to encourage them to remain loyal and to stand up bravely to the enemy's attack. Then, leaving 2 legions at Agedincum with the baggage trains of the whole army, I started for the district where the Boii were settled. On the following day I reached a stronghold of the Senones called Velaunodunum. I did not want my grain supply to be endangered by an enemy left in my rear, and so I decided to attack the place. In 2 days it was surrounded by our entrenchments, and on the 3rd day a deputation came out of the stronghold to discuss terms of surrender. I ordered them to hand over their arms, to deliver up all their pack animals, and to produce 600 hostages. I left one of my generals, Gaius Trebonius, to see that these orders were carried out, and since I wanted to get to Gorgobina as soon as possible, went on myself to Cinabum, in the country of the Carnutes. Here the people had only just heard that Velaunodunum was being besieged. They had imagined that this would be a long, drawn-out business, and were arranging to have troops sent in to garrison Cinabum, when, after an interval of 2 days, we appeared in front of the place. Because it was too late to attack immediately, we pitched camp near the city, and I put off the assault until the next day, telling the soldiers meanwhile to get everything ready for the operation. As there was a nearby bridge over the Loire, I ordered 2 legions to stand by under arms for the night, since I feared that the people might attempt to escape from the town under cover of darkness. And, in fact, Just before midnight, the inhabitants of Kinabum came out of the town in complete silence and began to make their way across the river. When our patrols informed me of this, I had the gates set on fire and sent into the town the 2 legions, which I had ordered to be ready for action. I captured the town, and, since the bridge and the other ways out were too narrow to allow any general exodus, took as prisoners practically the entire enemy population. The place was sacked, and everything it contained was distributed as booty among the soldiers. I then brought the army across the Loire and reached the country of the Bituriges. When Vercingetorix heard that I was coming, he raised the siege of Gorgobina and set out to meet me. I had begun to invest Noviodunum, a stronghold of the Bituriges which lay on my route, and deputies from this place had come out to beg me to forgive them and to spare their lives. We had already enjoyed some rapid successes, and, wishing to finish off this campaign with the same speed, I ordered arms to be surrendered, horses to be produced, and hostages to be delivered. Some of the hostages had already been handed over, and the rest of my conditions were in process of being fulfilled, as some centurions with a few troops had gone into the town to collect the arms and the livestock. At this moment, Vercingetorix's cavalry, which was riding in advance of his marching column, came into sight in the distance. As soon as the people in the town caught sight of it, and thought that there was a prospect of being relieved, they raised a shout and began to seize hold of their arms, to shut the gates, and to man the walls. The centurions inside the town saw, from the way the Gauls were behaving, that there had been some change in the situation. Drawing their swords, they seized the gates and brought all their men safely out. I ordered our cavalry out of camp to engage the enemy cavalry. Then, when I saw that our men were in difficulties, I sent to their support about 400 German horsemen whom I had kept with me from the beginning of the campaign. The Gauls could not stand up to the attack of these Germans. They were put to flight, and, after suffering severe losses, fell back on their main column. Once they were routed, the people of Noviodunum again became terrified. They arrested the people who, according to them, had been responsible for the popular rising, and after handing them over to me, surrendered themselves. Once this business was settled, I set out for Bourges, the largest and best fortified town of the Bituriges, lying in a particularly fertile part of the country. I felt sure that by capturing this town, I would secure the submission of the whole tribe. The Siege of Bourges. At Valonoronum, Kinabum, and Noviodunum, Vercingetorix had suffered a continuous series of setbacks. He now called his followers to a council of war, and proposed that the war should be fought on entirely different lines from those which had been followed up to now. Their chief endeavour, he said, must be to do everything possible to cut the Romans off from forage and supplies. This should be easy, since the Gauls were exceedingly strong in cavalry, and were also helped by the time of the year. There was no grass to cut, and therefore the enemy would have to disperse his forces in order to get fodder from barns and storehouses. Each one of these scattered parties could be marked down daily by the Gallic cavalry. Then, since the safety of everyone was at stake, individuals must give up their rights in their own property. All villages and farm buildings must be set on fire on each side of the Roman line of march, to the distance within possible reach of their foragers. The Gauls themselves had plenty of supplies, being able to draw on the resources of any tribe in whose country they might be operating. The Romans, on the other hand, would either starve or be forced to take the great risk of marching a long way from their camp, and it was immaterial whether the Gauls killed them or merely deprived them of their baggage, since without this they were unable to carry on a campaign. Finally, all towns which were not so well fortified or so well placed as to be safe from any danger ought to be set on fire. Otherwise, they might be used as refuge by Gauls wishing to escape military service, or by Romans who would plunder their supplies. And if Vercingetorix concluded these measures seemed cruel and difficult to bear, they should consider how much worse than all this it would be to have their wives and children carried off as slaves and to be killed themselves, which would certainly happen if they were conquered. The council unanimously approved of this proposal, and in a single day more than 20 cities of the Bituriges were set on fire. The same thing was done in the other states. Fires could be seen in every direction, a sad sight for all, yet they consoled themselves with the reflection that victory was now practically in their grasp, and felt confident that they would quickly recover everything they had lost. With regard to the town of Bourges, there was a discussion in a general assembly as to whether it should be burned or defended. The representatives of the Bituriges went down on their knees in front of delegates of the other tribes, and begged that they should not be compelled to set fire with their own hands to a city that was perhaps the most beautiful in the whole of Gaul, a city in which they took such pride, and which was so essential for the security of their state. It was naturally so strong, they said, that it could easily be defended, being almost entirely surrounded by the river and by marshes, through which there was only one very narrow way of approach. This request of theirs was granted. Vercingetorix was against it at first, but in the end gave in to the prayers of the Bituriges, and the general compassion that was felt for them. Specially chosen troops were detailed for the defence of the town. Vercingetorix now came after us by easy stages, and chose for his camp a position well protected by marshes and woods about 16 miles from Bourges. His patrols were constantly on the watch, and kept him informed of what was going on at the town throughout every moment of the day, and he issued his orders accordingly. He was always on the watch for parties of our men going out to get fodder or grain, and when they went far afield, as they had to do, and scattered over the country, he would attack them, often causing serious losses, though we on our side took all the precautions against him that we could think of, setting out at different times every day and going by different routes. My own camp was on the side of the town where there was a gap in the line formed by the river and marshes, the narrow entrance mentioned above. Here we began to move up mantlets and to construct a ramp with 2 towers, for the terrain made it impossible to build fortifications all around the place. Meanwhile, I kept on asking the Boii and the Aedui to send grain. The Aedui showed no enthusiasm at all, and were not much help, while the Boii, a small and weak tribe, had very little to spare, and soon used up what they did have. So, what with the poverty of the Boii, the slackness of the Aedui, and the burning of all granaries, our army was in very serious difficulties with regard to the grain supply. Indeed, for several days the soldiers had no grain at all, and only managed to keep themselves from starving by driving in the cattle from distant villages. Yet one would not have heard a word from any of them that was unworthy of the greatness of Rome and of the victories they had won already. I used to go and speak to the men of each legion while they were working. I would tell them that, if they found their privations unbearable, I was quite ready to raise the siege. But one and all they would beg me not to do so. They had now, they said, served under me for many years without ever disgracing themselves or even failing to finish any task to which they had set their hands. They would count it as a disgrace if they were to abandon this siege which they had begun, and they would rather undergo any hardship than fail to avenge the Roman citizens who had been treacherously massacred by the Gauls at Cinabum. Messages to the same effect were given by the troops to their centurions and officers, with the request that they should be passed on to me. Our siege towers had already been pushed up close to the wall when I discovered from prisoners that Vercingetorix had run out of forage, had moved his camp nearer to the town, and had gone off himself with the cavalry and the light infantry, which normally fought in conjunction with the cavalry, to set an ambush in a place where he thought our foragers would go next day. On receiving this information, I set out at midnight, making as little noise as possible, and reached the enemy's camp early in the morning. Their patrols had acted quickly and told them of our approach, and after hiding their wagons and baggage in the thickest parts of the woods, they had drawn up all their forces in the open on top of some rising ground. When I was informed of this, I immediately ordered our troops to pile their packs and make ready for action. The hill which the enemy occupied sloped up gently from the base, and was almost entirely surrounded by a marsh not more than 50 feet across, but very difficult to pass. The Gauls had broken down the causeways over the marsh, and were no doubt confident in the natural strength of their position. They were formed up by tribes and stationed so as to guard every ford and thicket which led into the marsh, and their intention was, if we attempted to force our way through, to charge down on us while we were struggling in the muddy water. Seeing how close they were, anyone might have thought that the Gauls were ready to stand up to us in fair fight. But if one took note of the inequality of the conditions, he could have recognized that this was mere show and empty bravado on their part. Our troops were furious at the enemy's daring to stand waiting for them at such close range, and clamoured for the signal to charge. But I explained to them that victory here would be a costly business, and could only be won by the loss of many gallant lives. I told them that, after I had seen them so ready to face any danger in order to win me glory, I should myself be guilty of the worst sort of injustice, if I failed to put their lives first, and my own interests afterward. In this way I calmed them down, and led them back to camp on the same day. Here we went on with our preparations for the siege of the town. When Vercingetorix got back, he was accused of treachery, on the grounds that he had moved his camp nearer to the Romans, that he had gone away with all the cavalry, that he had left such a large army behind him with no one in supreme command of it, and that as soon as he had gone the Romans had appeared upon the scene, thus making the quickest possible use of their opportunity. All this, it was contended, could not have happened by accident. It must have been planned. No doubt Vercingetorix wished to be granted the kingship of Gaul by Caesar, rather than to have it bestowed upon him by his own people. To these accusations Vercingetorix replied that he had moved camp because they were short of fodder, and that he had done so at their own request. He had gone nearer to the Romans because he had seen the advantages of the position, which was naturally so strong that it needed no defence works. As for the cavalry, there should have been no need for it on marshy ground, whereas it had been useful in the district where he took it. He had deliberately refrained from appointing anyone to the supreme command when he left, because he was afraid that whoever held such a post might be forced to fall in with the wishes of the majority and fight a pitched battle, which he could see they all wanted to do merely from lack of resolution and inability to go on bearing hardships. If the enemy's arrival was due to chance, then they had chance to thank for it. If it was due to information supplied by one of themselves, they ought to be grateful to whoever it was for giving them the chance of seeing from above how weak the Roman army was, and of being able to despise the cowardice of troops who went ingloriously back to camp without daring to offer battle. As to the supreme power, he said, I have no need to seek that from Caesar as the reward of treachery, when I could win it for myself as the result of a victory which I and all the Gauls together have already almost won. If you think that by giving power to me you are gratifying my vanity rather than increasing your own security, then take back all the titles that you have given me. And now, so that you may believe that I am telling you the plain truth, Listen to what these Roman soldiers have to say." He then produced some slaves whom he had captured a few days previously when foraging, and had since exposed to the tortures of hunger and of chains. They had already been told what to say when questioned, and now stated that they were Roman legionaries who had been forced by the pangs of hunger to slip out secretly from camp to see if they could find any grain or cattle in the fields. The whole army, they said, was suffering from starvation just as they were. No one had any strength left. It was impossible to carry on with the daily work, and for this reason the commander-in-chief had decided that if they made no further progress with the siege of the town, he would withdraw the army in the next 3 days. "And this," said Vercingetorix, "is what you owe to me, whom you are now accusing of treason. Thanks to me, you see a great and victorious army worn out by hunger, and this has been achieved without the shedding of a drop of your blood. And I have also made sure that when this army has to turn tail disgracefully and try to make its way back, not a single state will allow it inside its frontiers." The whole assembly cheered and clashed their arms together, the usual Gallic way of showing approval of what a speaker has said. Vercingetorix, they declared, was a general of the first order. His loyalty could not be questioned. His conduct of the war could not have been more intelligent. They decided to send into the town 10,000 troops picked from all the tribal contingents, the reason for this being that they did not want the Bituriges to be given sole responsibility for this national effort, since they realized that if they saved the town, the Bituriges would be able to claim all the credit for the final victory. Our men showed the most remarkable courage and energy, but were confronted by all sorts of contrivances on the part of the Gauls, who are indeed a most ingenious race, wonderful imitators, and very good at making practical use of ideas suggested to them by others. For example, they lassoed our siege hooks, and, when they had caught them fast, pulled them aside and hauled them into the town by means of windlasses. They also tried to undermine our ramp, and did this remarkably skillfully, for they do a lot of iron mining in their country, and know all about the various methods of working underground. Moreover, they had built towers all along the whole circuit of their wall, and covered them with hides. They were constantly making sorties by both day and night, and either trying to set fire to our ramp or attacking the men who were working on it. And as our ramp rose day by day, and our towers came up higher, they correspondingly raised the level of their own towers by building on extra stories. They also countermined our subterranean tunnels, and tried to prevent their extension to the wall by making fences of fire-hardened stakes, by pouring in boiling pitch, or by blocking the way with enormous stones. Nearly all Gallic town walls are built on the following plan. Beams of timber are laid on the ground at intervals of 2 feet, all along the length of the wall, and at right angles to it. The beams are then fastened together on the inside and banked up with a good lot of earth. The intervals between them are fitted in with large stones facing outward. When this course has been laid and the beams tightly fastened together, another course is laid on top of it. This is arranged so that, while the same interval is maintained between the beams, those of the second course are not in contact with those of the first, but are laid on a layer of stones 2 feet high. Thus each beam has one stone between it and the one below, and is kept firmly in position. Course is added to course in the same way until the wall reaches the required height. This is an agreeable style of building to look at, with the variety of alternate layers of timbers and stones, all running in straight lines at proper intervals from each other. It is also, from a practical point of view, a style that is very useful for the defense of cities. The stone gives protection from fire, and the wood resists battering rams, which can neither breach nor shake to bits a structure that is secured on the inside by beams which generally run to a length of 40 feet. All these expedients of the Gauls certainly held up operations. Our men were also hampered by cold weather, which lasted all the time, and by continual showers of rain. But by never stopping work, they overcame every difficulty. In 25 days they raised a ramp 320 feet wide and nearly 80 feet high, which almost touched the wall. One night, just before midnight, when, as usual, I was staying out with the men on duty, encouraging them not to relax their efforts for a moment, we saw smoke rising from the ramp. The enemy had driven a tunnel underneath it and set it on fire. At the same moment we heard the noise of shouting all along the wall, and the enemy came pouring out of the town by the 2 gates on either side of our towers. Others, standing on the wall, flung torches and dry wood onto the ramp, or poured down pitch and every other sort of inflammable material. It was hard to know which sector needed relief most, or where one should first meet the attack. However, I regularly had 2 legions stationed outside the camp and ready for action every night, while still larger numbers of soldiers worked by shifts on the siege operations. So it was quickly arranged for some of our men to beat off the attacks from the town, while others dragged back the towers and cut a gap in the ramp, and everyone in the camp rushed out to extinguish the fire. Fighting continued at all points through the rest of the night. The enemy's hopes of victory kept on rising again and again, particularly when they saw that the protective screens around the towers were burned up, so that it was not easy for our men without cover to come up in support of their comrades. Meanwhile, on their side, fresh troops constantly relieved those who were exhausted, and they all believed that on these few moments of time depended the fate of Gaul. Before our eyes one incident took place which we thought most remarkable, and which I ought to mention. Standing in front of the town gate was a Gaul, who took lumps of tallow and pitch, as they were handed to him, and threw them into the fire that was burning near one of our towers. He was struck in the right side by an arrow from a catapult, and fell down dead. Another man standing nearby stepped over the prostrate body, and went on with the job. He too was killed in the same way by a shot from a catapult. Then his place was taken by a 3rd man, who in turn was followed by a 4th. Indeed, that position was never abandoned until the fire on the terrace had been put out, the enemy pushed back everywhere, and the fighting come to an end. The enemy had now tried everything without success. Next day they decided to follow the advice and instructions of Vercingetorix and try to make their escape from the town. By making the attempt at dead of night, they hoped to be able to get away without serious loss, since Vercingetorix's camp was not far from the town, and the continuous lines of marshes which filled all the space between would delay our pursuit. Night came, and they were already getting ready to make the attempt, when suddenly the wives came running out into the streets and threw themselves down in tears at the feet of their husbands, begging and praying them not to abandon them and their children to the vengeance of the enemy, simply because they were by nature not strong enough to join in the escape. When they saw that the men were not going to change their minds, for it is generally the case that in extreme danger fear drives out pity, they began to cry out all together, and make signs to our troops to show that an escape was intended. The Gauls now became alarmed, and gave up their plan, for they feared that our cavalry would seize the roads before they could get to them. Next day, the siege works which we had begun were completed, and one of the towers was moved forward. A great storm of rain blew up, and it occurred to me that this might be the right moment to make the assault, as I noticed that the guards on the wall were not so carefully posted as usual. I told our men to go about their work as though they were not taking things very seriously, and explained to them what I wanted done. Under cover of screens and out of view of the enemy, the legions got ready for action. Now, at last, I told them, they could enjoy the fruits of victory in reward for all that they had done. I offered prizes to those who first scaled the walls, and then I gave the signal for attack. The men suddenly dashed forward from every direction and quickly lined the wall. Confused and terrified by the unexpectedness of it all, the enemy were dislodged from the fortifications and the towers, but they stood firm in the marketplace and other open spaces, forming up in compact bodies with the intention of deploying into line to meet any attack that might be made on them and fighting to the finish. But when they saw that no one was coming down to meet them on level ground, but instead our troops were coming all around them, occupying the entire circuit of the walls, they began to fear that they were being cut off from all hope of escape, and throwing away their arms, they all made a combined rush to the farthest part of the town. Some of them, crowded up together in the narrow passage leading to the gates, were killed there by our troops. Others got through the gates only to be cut down by our cavalry. It did not occur to any of our men to make money by taking prisoners. They were so infuriated by the massacre at Kinnabum, and by all the trouble they had had over the siege, that they spared no one, neither old men, women, nor small children. In the end, out of a total population of about 40,000, scarcely 800 who had taken to flight at the very first sound of the attack got safely through to Vercingetorix, who took them in late at night and as quietly as possible. He was afraid that the whole crowd of them together in his camp would arouse such compassion that there would be a risk of a general mutiny, and so he stationed his own friends and chieftains of the states along the roads some distance away with instructions to sort out the fugitives and have them conducted to their own people in whatever part of the camp had been allotted to the various tribes at the beginning of the campaign. Next day, a council of war was called, and Vercingetorix did what he could to encourage his people, telling them not to be too downhearted or distressed by what had happened. The Romans, he said, owed their victory not to courage in the field, but to a kind of technical proficiency, and a knowledge of siegecraft in which the Gauls lacked experience. It was a mistake to imagine that in warfare everything would always go one's own way, and in this instance his hearers could bear witness to the fact that he himself had never been in favour of trying to defend Bourges. What had really caused the present disaster was that the Bituriges had been unwise, and that the rest had been too easily influenced by them. He promised, however, that he would soon bring them advantages which would more than make up for this defeat. His efforts were now directed toward bringing over to their side those states which, so far, had not joined the Gallic alliance. He would then establish one policy for the whole of Gaul. If Gaul were united, the whole world could not stand against her. Moreover, these plans of his were already on the point of being carried into practice. Meanwhile, he felt that, for the safety of everyone, he could reasonably ask them to set to work and fortify their camp so that they would be in a better position to meet any sudden attack that the enemy might make. This speech of his went down well with the Gauls, largely because Vercingetorix himself had not lost heart after such a great disaster, and had neither hidden himself away nor avoided contact with his army. He was considered to have shown exceptional qualities of forethought and of intuition because, while things were still in the balance, he had recommended first the burning of Bourges, and later its evacuation. In most cases, failure diminishes the prestige of a commander, but in this case, on the contrary, Vercingetorix found that every day which followed his defeat brought him more honour. At the same time, the Gauls were much encouraged by his assurances of bringing over the other states to join them. Now, for the first time, they actually set to work on building a fortified camp. To such an extent had they gained in resolution that, though they are by no means used to hard work, they thought that they ought patiently to do what they were told to do, and on his side Vercingetorix did no less than he had promised. He took every measure that he could think of to bring in the states that still remained outside the alliance, and tried to attract their leaders by bribes and by promises. His agents were specially selected for the job, being all men who were either friends of the people concerned, or else able to sway opinion by their skill in argument. He provided arms and clothing for those who had escaped from the sack of Bourges. Also, in order to bring his weakened forces up to full strength again, he ordered the various states to send fixed numbers of fresh troops, telling them exactly how many each state was to produce, and on what day they were to be brought into camp. And he ordered that all archers, of whom there were a great many in Gaul, were to be called up and sent to him. In these ways he quickly made up the losses that had been sustained at Bourges. Meanwhile, Teutomatus, the king of the Nitiobriges, whose father Olavico had been granted the title Friend by our Senate, brought to Vercingetorix a large detachment of cavalry, some from his own tribe, and others whom he had hired in Aquitania. Defeat at Gergovia and revolt of the Aedui. I stayed for several days at Bourges. The enormous quantities of grain and other supplies which we found then made it possible for the troops to get back their health after the hardships and lack of food from which they had suffered. Winter was now nearly over. It was the right time of the year for beginning military operations, and I had already decided to march against the enemy, hoping either to entice them out of the marshes and forests, or else to be able to blockade them where they were. At this point some leading men of the Aedui came to beg me to intervene in what was a most critical situation in their country. Here, they said, there existed a most dangerous state of affairs. Their custom was, and long had been, to elect one magistrate each year to hold sovereign power. But there were now 2 such magistrates in office, and each of them claimed to have been legally elected. One was Convicto Litavis, a wealthy and distinguished young man, and the other, Cotus, who came from a very ancient family, was himself a person of great influence, and with important connections, and whose brother Valetiacus had held the same office in the previous year. Now, the whole state was up in arms. The council was split, and so were the people in general, each of the 2 claimants having his own following. If the quarrel went on any longer, civil war was a certainty. It was up to me, they said, to prevent this by looking into the matter and exercising my authority. I thought that it would be much against our interests to abandon the campaign and move away from the enemy. On the other hand, I knew only too well how serious can be the results of such political strife. The Aedui were a large state, very closely bound to us. I had always done what I could for them, and had treated them with particular distinction. I did not want them now to come to blows with each other, and, for the side which thought itself the weaker, to call in the aid of Vercingetorix. Indeed, it seemed to me that I should do everything possible to prevent this from happening. According to Aeduan law, the holders of the chief magistracy are not allowed to go outside their country. So, in order to avoid giving the impression that I was lacking in respect for their established constitution, I decided to go myself into their country, and invited their whole council and the 2 parties to the dispute to meet me at Desetia. Almost all members of the council came to the meeting place, and I was informed that what had happened was this. A small secret assembly had been held at the wrong time in the wrong place, and at this assembly Valetiacus had declared his brother duly elected, although, according to law, it was forbidden for two members of one family to be elected magistrates during the lifetime of both, or even to sit together as members of the council. I therefore ordered Cotus to resign from his position, and told Convicto Litovis, who had been elected constitutionally at a time when the office was vacant, and with approval of the Druids, to continue in power. After making this decision between the two parties, I urged the Aedui to think no more about their differences and their quarrels, and, leaving all such things aside, to devote themselves exclusively to this war which we were fighting. I told them that once I had completed the conquest of Gaul, they could expect to receive from me the rewards which they deserved, and I asked them to send me at once their entire cavalry force and 10,000 infantry to be stationed in various positions to guard our convoys. Next, I divided the army in two. I gave Labienus 4 legions, and instructed him to lead them against the Senones and the Parisii. I took the other 6 myself, and led them along the river Allier to Gergovia, in the country of the Arverni. I took some of the cavalry with me, and gave some to Labienus. As soon as he heard what we were doing, Vercingetorix had all the bridges over the Allier destroyed, and began to march along the bank opposite us. Separated as they were, the two armies were in sight of each other. The Gauls usually camped just opposite us, with patrols posted along the banks to prevent us from building a bridge and getting across to their side of the river. My position was thus extremely difficult. Usually the Allier cannot be forded until autumn, and I began to fear that this river was going to hold me up for most of the summer. To prevent this, I pitched camp in a wood opposite one of the bridges which Vercingetorix had destroyed, and on the following day kept 2 legions hidden there, while sending on the rest of the army with all the baggage, as usual. Some cohorts had been broken up into smaller detachments, so that it would look as though all 6 legions were on the march. I ordered them to go forward as far as they could, and when it came to the time of day at which I supposed them to be safe in camp, I began to rebuild the bridge, using the original piles, the lower parts of which were still intact. The work was soon finished. I took the legions across, selected a good place for a camp, and then recalled the rest of the army. When Vercingetorix heard of this, he hurried ahead as fast as he could, not wanting to be forced to fight against his will. From here we reached Gergovia after 5 days' marching. On the day we arrived, a slight cavalry skirmish took place, and I reconnoitred the position of the town. It was built on a high mountain, and was very difficult to approach from every direction. I could see no hope of taking it by assault, and decided not to do anything about besieging it until I had made sure of our grain supply. Vercingetorix, on his side, had made his camp near the town. The various tribal contingents were each in their separate quarters all around him. Every height along the ridge from which one could get a good view had been occupied by his men, and the general appearance of his forces was formidable enough. The chieftains of states whom he had appointed to act as his counsellors were summoned to meet him every morning at dawn to exchange information and attend to business. And he scarcely let a day pass without sending into action some detachment of cavalry interspersed with archers, so as to test the spirit and fighting qualities of each man under his command. Opposite the town, and rising from the very foot of the mountain, there was a hill which, with precipices on all sides of it, formed a remarkably strong position. If we could get hold of it, it seemed certain that we should be able to cut the enemy off from their main water supply, and make it hard for them to go out foraging. However, the enemy had a garrison, though not a very strong one, to hold the place. In spite of this, I set out from camp at dead of night, drove out the garrison before it could be reinforced from the town, and took over the post. Here I stationed 2 legions, connecting the larger camp with the smaller by a double trench 12 feet high, so that men could come and go, even one at a time, without any fear of being suddenly attacked by the enemy. While these operations were going on at Gergovia, the Aeduan Convictor Letalis, who, as already mentioned, had been confirmed in his magistracy by my intervention, was approached and bribed by the Arverni. He then entered into negotiations with some young men who were led by Litalicus and his brothers, people of a very good family. He shared with them the money that he had received as a bribe, and urged them to remember that they were born free and born to rule. It was only the Aedui, he said, who stood in the way of what would otherwise be an absolutely certain victory for the Gauls, and it was because of Aeduan influence that other states had been prevented from joining the alliance. But if the Aedui joined in with the rest, the Romans would have no kind of foothold in Gaul. It is true, he said, that I am under some sort of an obligation to Caesar, but all it amounts to is that I won my case, which was a perfectly just one, with him as an adjudicator. My real duty is owed not to him, but to the liberty of us all. Indeed, why should we Aedui call in the help of Caesar in interpreting our own legal rights? We might just as well expect the Romans to come and ask us to arbitrate in their affairs. The young men were quickly won over by the speech of the chief magistrate, and by the money which he offered them. They readily undertook to take the lead in the plot, but it was first necessary to decide how to go about it, since they were by no means sure that the state could be induced to go to war without some compelling reason. It was decided that Litalicus should be appointed to the command of the 10,000 troops who were being sent to me for use in the war. He was to organize the march of this army, and meanwhile his brothers were to go on ahead to me. They also agreed on how the remainder of the plan was to be carried out. So Litalicus took over the Aeduan army, and when he was about 30 miles from Gergovia, suddenly called a meeting of the soldiers. He spoke with tears streaming from his eyes. "Where are we going, soldiers?" he said. "All our cavalry, all the nobility of our state has perished. 2 of our leading men, Eporerix and Veridomarus, have been accused of treachery by the Romans, and have been put to death without a trial. You shall hear the story from men who were actually there, and escaped from the massacre. As for me, my brothers, and all my family have been killed. Grief for them makes it impossible for me to describe to you exactly what happened." Some people were then brought forward who had already received from Litalicus instructions as to what he wanted said. They told the troops the same story he had told. Great numbers of the Aeduan cavalry, they said, had been killed because it was alleged that they had been in contact with the Arverni. They themselves had managed to hide among the crowd of soldiers, and so had escaped while the massacre was still going on. All the Aedui shouted out in anger, and begged Litalicus to think out what could be done for them. "It is not," he replied, "a question of thinking anything out. It is a matter of necessity. We must march straight for Gergovia, and join the Arverni. Is it not certain that the Romans, after the dreadful crime they have committed, are now on their way here to kill us too? So, if we have any spirit left in us, let us avenge the shameful death of our friends by putting an end to these robbers whom we have with us." With these words he pointed to some Roman citizens who, relying on his protection, had been travelling with his army. He now had them cruelly tortured and put to death, and plundered the large stores of grain and other supplies they had with them. He then sent messengers all over the country of the Aedui to arouse opinion by repeating the same lie about the massacre of the cavalry and the nobility, and to urge the people to act as he had done, and to revenge themselves on their oppressors. The two Aeduans, Eporedorix and Viridomarus, had come to serve with the cavalry of their tribe in response to a personal summons of my own. Eporedorix was a young man who came from one of the best families, and had much influence in his own country. Viridomarus, equally popular, was a man of the same age, though not well born. He had been recommended to me by Diviciacus, and, though his origins were humble, I had raised him to a position of great honor and responsibility. These two were rivals for power, and in the recent dispute about the supreme magistracy, Eporedorix had done all he could for Convictor Litavis, and Viridomarus had given equal support to Cotus. Now, when Eporedorix heard of the plans of Litavicus, he came to me about midnight, and told me all he knew. He begged me not to allow the tribe to lose the friendship and regard of Rome, simply because of the wicked schemes of certain young men. Yet he saw well that a breach between us and the Aedui would be inevitable if all those thousands of troops joined the enemy, since their families would have to think of their safety, and the tribal government would have to take the matter seriously. As I had invariably shown most particular consideration to the nation of the Aedui, this news came as a great shock to me. Without a moment's hesitation, I set out from camp with 4 legions in light marching order, and all the cavalry. There was no time to reduce the area of the camps. The situation was critical, and everything seemed to depend on speed. I left Gaius Fabius behind with 2 legions to guard the camps. I ordered the arrest of the brothers of Litavicus, but found that they had just fled to the enemy. I told the troops that this was a critical moment, and that they must be prepared to put up with some hard marching. Everyone showed the greatest enthusiasm, and after advancing for 25 miles, we came in sight of the Aeduan column. I sent the cavalry forward to slow down and hamper their march, but issued orders that no one was to kill any of them. I told Eporedorix and Viridomarus, whom the Aedui imagined to have been killed, to show themselves among the cavalry, and to speak to their own people. They were soon recognized, and it became plain that Litavicus had been deceiving his troops. Thereupon the Aedui began to stretch out their hands in token of surrender, to throw down their arms and to beg for mercy. Litavicus, with his own retainers, escaped to Gergovia, for, according to Gallic custom, it is a crime for a retainer to desert his lord, however desperate the situation may be. I sent messengers to the Aeduan government to inform them that, according to the laws of war, I would have been perfectly justified in putting their men to death, but that I had chosen to be merciful, and had spared their lives. I then gave the army 3 hours of the night to rest. Then we started for Gergovia. When we had done about half the distance, some cavalrymen, who had been sent by Fabius, arrived and told me what a dangerous position they had been in. Their report was that the enemy had launched an attack on our camp in full force. They had sent in more and more fresh troops to relieve those who were tired, with the result that our men, who had had no respite at all, since the siege of the camp made it necessary for the same troops to be always on duty on the rampart, had become exhausted. Many of our soldiers had been wounded by the showers of arrows, and every other kind of missile that had been launched against them. Our artillery, however, had been very useful indeed in repelling the enemy attacks. In the end, the enemy had withdrawn, and Fabius was now blocking up all the gates except 2, and erecting screens along the ramparts in preparation for meeting the same sort of attack next day. On receiving this news, I called upon the soldiers for a supreme effort, and we reached camp before dawn. While these actions were going on at Gergovia, the Aedui received the first messages sent to them from Litavicus. They took no trouble to investigate the truth of these reports. Some were swayed by greed, and others by anger, or by that rash impetuosity which is so characteristic of all Gauls, and the result was that they accepted mere rumour as established fact. They seized the goods of Roman citizens, killed some, and dragged others off into slavery. Convictor Letavis was behind the general movement, and did his best to inflame the feelings of his people in the hope that, once they had involved themselves deeply in crime, they would be ashamed to come back to their right mind. One of my senior officers, Marcus Aristius, was on the way to join his legion, and had stopped at the town of Cabellinum. The Aedui induced him to leave the place by promising him a safe conduct, and then compelled all Roman traders who had settled there to leave with him. As soon as they set out, they attacked them and robbed them of all their baggage. The Romans fought back, but were surrounded and blockaded for a day and a night, after which, when many people had been killed on both sides, the Aedui brought up still greater numbers of armed men. It was at this point that the news arrived that their whole army was in my hands and at my mercy. Their leaders immediately hurried to see Aristius, and assured him that what had taken place had had no sanction from the government. They ordered an inquiry into the theft of Roman property, confiscated the goods of Letavicus and of his brothers, and sent a deputation to me in order to excuse themselves. Their object in doing this was to get their own people back safe. At the same time, they were stained with crime. They liked the prospect of the profit to be made out of the plundered goods. Very many of them were implicated in this business, and they were frightened that they would have to suffer for what they had done. So they were secretly beginning to make plans for war, and were sending around deputations to intrigue with the other tribes. I was perfectly aware of all this, but nevertheless I treated their deputation in the gentlest possible way, assuring them that I was not taking a severe view of the Aeduan government simply because the Aeduan people had behaved ignorantly and irresponsibly, and that indeed I felt just the same goodwill toward the Aedui as before. In fact, I expected that the revolution in Gaul would spread. I had no wish to find myself isolated with every single tribe against me, and I was beginning to think in terms of withdrawing from Gergovia, and once again concentrating the whole army. But I did not want such a withdrawal to look as though it were a headlong flight, occasioned by fear of a general uprising. I was still thinking along these lines when I got what seemed to me an excellent opportunity for fighting a successful action. I had gone to the smaller camp to inspect the defences, and while I was there, I noticed that one of the hills, normally held by the enemy, was left unguarded. Previously there had been so many troops to hold it that one had scarcely been able to see the ground where they stood. This was surprising, and I questioned some of the deserters who were now coming in to me in great numbers every day. They all confirmed the information which I had already received from my patrols, and which was as follows. Behind this hill was a ridge, which was practically level, but wooded and narrow at the point where it ran up close to the further side of the town. The enemy were exceedingly anxious about the safety of this ridge, feeling that if they lost another hill, in addition to the one we held already, they would find themselves almost walled in and cut off from the open country and from foraging. Vercingetorix had therefore withdrawn every available man to work on the fortifications of this ridge. After receiving this information, I sent out a few cavalry squadrons about midnight, and told them to ride over the country, making rather more noise than usual. At dawn I ordered a large number of pack-horses and mules brought out of camp, and their pack-saddles taken off. The drivers were told to put on helmets and ride around over the high ground, looking as though they were regular cavalry. I sent a few real cavalrymen with them, and instructed them to spread out over a wide area, and let themselves be seen. They were all to converge on the same point after making a wide detour. All this could be seen from the town, since from Gergovia one could look right down on our camp. But the distance was too great for the enemy to be quite certain of what was going on. Next I sent one legion out along the high ground in the same direction, and then, after it had advanced a little way, halted it rather lower down the hill, and concealed it in a wood. The Gauls became more and more convinced that some move was impending, and brought all their forces up to defend what seemed to be the threatened spot. Once I saw that their camps were empty, I told our men to cover up the crests of their helmets, and to hide the standards. I then moved them from the large camp to the lesser one in small parties, so as not to be seen from the town. I told every general in command of a legion what I wanted done, and in particular I warned them that they must keep a tight hand on their troops in case they should be carried away by enthusiasm for the fight and hope of plunder, and should advance too far. I pointed out that we were attacking uphill, and were therefore at a disadvantage, which speed alone could overcome. The object of the operation was to catch the enemy by surprise, not to fight him in a regular battle. After explaining these points, I gave the signal for attack, and at the same time sent the Aedui up the hill by another route on the right. From the point where the ascent began, the distance up to the town wall was about a mile, or would have been if the path had been straight. As it was, the troops had to go a zigzag route in order to make the climbing easier, and this, of course, added to the distance to be covered. About halfway up, the Gauls had built a 6-foot wall of large stones, which followed the natural contours of the ground, and was intended to check any attack we might make. The area below the wall was unoccupied, but all the upper part of the hill, right up to the town walls, was covered with their encampments, all placed close together. As soon as the signal was given, our troops quickly advanced to the wall, climbed over it, and captured 3 of the camps. This operation indeed was carried out at such speed that Teutomotus, the king of the Nitiobriges, was caught by surprise while having an afternoon sleep in his tent. The soldiers had turned to plunder, and he just managed to get away from them, naked to the waist, and riding a wounded horse. We had now attained the aims which I had set myself. I ordered the retreat to be sounded, and immediately brought the 10th Legion, which was with me, to a halt. The soldiers of the other legions, who were at the other side of a fairly deep depression, did not hear the trumpet call. Nevertheless, commanding officers and others tried to hold the men back in accordance with my instructions. The troops, however, seeing the enemy in flight and remembering all their former successes, were on fire with the hope of winning a quick victory. They thought that no obstacle could exist that they could not overcome by hard fighting, and they pressed the pursuit right up to the wall of the town and the town gates. A noise of shouting arose from every quarter of the city. Those who were farthest away from the scene of action were terrified at the sudden uproar, and, thinking that the enemy must already be inside the gates, fled outside the fortifications. The women threw down clothing and money from the ramparts, and leaned over with bared breasts and outstretched hands, begging the soldiers to spare them, and not to massacre women and children alike, as they had done at Bourges. Some were lowered down by hand from the walls, and gave themselves up to the soldiers. Lucius Fabius, a centurion of the 8th Legion, had, as we found out later, told his men that he had his eye on the sort of reward that I had given at Bourges, and he was not going to let anyone else scale the wall before he did. Now he got 3 men of his company to hoist him up, mounted the wall, and then, in his turn, pulled them up, one by one, to join him. Meanwhile, the Gauls, who, as already pointed out, had all gone off to the farther side of the town to strengthen the fortifications, first heard the shouting, and then were still further alarmed by a succession of messengers, who came to tell them that the town was in our hands. Sending their cavalry on in front, they all hurried after in a dense mass of men. Each man, as he arrived, took up his position under the ramparts, and swelled the ranks of those already in action. Soon great numbers of them had got together, and the women, who a moment before had been stretching out their hands to the Romans from the wall, now began to direct their entreaties to their own men, leaning over in Gallic fashion with their hair dishevelled, and bringing forward their children for the men to see. We were now at a disadvantage as regards both numbers and position. Our troops were exhausted by the rapid ascent, and by the long time they had been in action. It was difficult for them to stand up against opponents who were just coming, perfectly fresh, into battle. I saw that we were fighting in a most awkward position, and that the enemy's strength was increasing. Becoming alarmed about the safety of my men, I sent to Titus Sextius, whom I had left to guard the smaller camp, and ordered him to bring his cohorts quickly into the open and draw them up at the foot of the hill on the enemy's right flank, so that, if he saw that our men were being driven down from their position, he would be in the right place to prevent the enemy from pursuing as they wished. I myself, with the 10th Legion, advanced a little way from the place where we had halted, and waited to see how the battle would end. The fighting was at close quarters, and was raging fiercely, the enemy trusting in their superior position and numbers, our men relying on their own courage, when suddenly the Aedui, whom I had sent up by another route to create a diversion, came into view on our exposed flank. The similarity of their armour to that of the other Gauls caused terror among our men. Even though it could be seen that their right shoulders were uncovered, the usual sign to show that they were friends, the troops still thought that this was something done deliberately by the enemy to deceive them. At the same time, the centurion Lucius Fabius and the others who had scaled the wall with him were surrounded and killed, and their bodies hurled down from the wall. Marcus Petronius, a centurion of the same legion, had been trying to break down the gate, but was surrounded by a host of enemies, and, having been wounded again and again, saw that his position was hopeless. He shouted out to the men of his company who had followed him, "I can't save both myself and you, but at least I'll see that you get away safely. It was I who led you into danger. I was too anxious to distinguish myself. Now look after yourselves. I'm giving you the chance." With these words he charged into the middle of the enemy, killed 2 men, and drove the rest a little way back from the gate. His comrades tried to help him, but he called out to them, "It's no use trying to save my life. I've lost too much blood and my strength is going. Get away while you have the chance and fall back on the legion." A few moments later he fell, still fighting, but he had saved his men. Our troops were hard-pressed on every side. 46 centurions had been lost, and in the end we were driven down from our position. But the Gauls were prevented from doing us too much damage on our retreat, because they were checked by the 10th Legion, which was drawn up in support on rather more level ground. The 10th, in its turn, was covered by cohorts of the 13th, which had marched out of the smaller camp with Titus Sextius, and had occupied a position above the level of the plain. As soon as the legions reached level ground, they turned about and faced the enemy in battle formation. But Vercingetorix withdrew his men from the foot of the hill, and led them back inside the fortifications. On that day we lost nearly 700 men. Next day, I called a meeting of the soldiers and reprimanded them for the over-eagerness and lack of restraint which they had shown in having ventured to decide for themselves where they ought to go and what they ought to do, in failing to halt when the signal for retreat was given, and in disobeying the orders of their generals and their officers. I pointed out what the effects could be of having to fight in the wrong position, and reminded them that it was this very thing which I myself had been so concerned about at Bourges, when, after I had caught the enemy without their commander and without their cavalry, I nevertheless chose to forego a certain victory rather than incur even slight casualties by fighting on unfavourable ground. Much, I said, as I admired their magnificent spirit, which no obstacle had been able to check, not the fortifications of the camp, nor the height of the mountain, nor the actual wall of the town, I was just as much offended by their insubordination and by their presumption in imagining that they knew more than their commander-in-chief about how to win victories and how battles would turn out. From my soldiers, I said, I expect not only courage and gallantry in action, but also discipline and self-control. After making these points, I said a few words at the end of my speech to raise the soldiers' spirits, telling them that they must not be discouraged by what had happened, and must not think that their losses were due to the warlike qualities of the enemy, when in fact they were caused by fighting on unfavourable ground. I still felt as before about the advisability of withdrawing from Gergovia, but first I led the legions out of camp and drew them up in line of battle in a good position. Vercingetorix still refused to come down onto level ground, and after a minor cavalry action in which we had the better of things, I led the army back to camp. We did the same thing next day. Then, thinking that enough had been done to humble the arrogance of the Gauls and to re-establish the morale of my own men, I moved camp and marched into the country of the Aedui. Not even at this point did the enemy make any attempt to follow us. 3 days later we reached the Allier, where we repaired one of the bridges, and I led the army across. Here I was greeted by the 2 Aedui, Viridomarus and Ephorerix. They told me that Litavicus had set out with all the cavalry, and was trying to subvert the loyalty of the tribe. It was essential, they said, for them to get there before he did, so that they could encourage the government to remain in allegiance to us. I had by now plenty of evidence to show that the Aedui were disloyal, and I thought it likely that if I let these 2 men go, the revolt would break out all the sooner. Nevertheless, I decided not to detain them. I did not want to appear to be acting high-handedly, and I did not want it to look as though I was afraid. Before they departed, I briefly reminded them of what I had done for the Aedui, and I recalled to their memory the humiliating condition their tribe had been in when I first came to Gaul, how they had been penned inside their towns, deprived of their lands, stripped of their wealth, forced both to pay a tribute and to surrender hostages under the most shameful circumstances. From this state I had raised them to power and prosperity, not only giving them back the position which they had once held, but making them more important and more powerful than they had ever been in the past. I told the 2 Aeduans to hand on this message, and then let them go. In the Aeduan town of Noviodunum, which is on the banks of the Loire, in a good position for defence, I had collected all the hostages from the whole of Gaul, the stores of grain, the public funds, and much of my own luggage, and that of the army. I had also sent there great numbers of horses, which I had brought up for this campaign from Italy and Spain. When Ephorerix and Viridomarus reached this town, they heard the news of what was happening in their tribe. Litavicus had been received by the Aedui in Bibracte, their most important town. The chief magistrate, Convictor Litavis, and most of the tribal council had joined him there, and an official deputation had been sent to Vercingetorix to make a treaty of peace and alliance with him. The opportunity now in their hands seemed to these two Aedui too good to be missed, so they massacred the garrison at Noviodunum, together with all those who had settled there as traders. They divided the money and the horses between them, and they arranged to have the hostages from the various states escorted to their own magistrate at Bebructe. Since they considered that the town could not be defended, they set it on fire so that it should not be of any use to us. All the grain that could be handled quickly was loaded onto boats and taken away. The remainder was either set on fire or thrown into the river. They then began to raise troops in the neighborhood, posted garrisons, and organized patrols along the Loire, and sent out cavalry to show themselves all over the countryside, and intimidate all opposition. Their aim was to cut us off from our grain supply, or to reduce us to such a state of want that we should be forced to leave Gaul and retire to the province. Their hopes of success were very greatly encouraged by the fact that the Loire was so swollen as the result of the melting snow that it appeared to be quite impossible to ford. When I learned what had happened, I decided that I must act quickly. If we had to build bridges, we might be forced to fight, and it would be better to do so quickly, before the enemy could bring still larger forces up to the river. There were some who were frightened enough to suggest that I should alter my whole plan of campaign and fall back upon the province. I did not think so. This would not only have been a most humiliating and shameful step to take, there would also have been great difficulties in getting across the Savane, and most of all, I was anxious about Labienus and his legions, who were separated from me. We therefore marched by day and night, making much longer distances than usual, and reached the Loire long before anyone could have expected us. With the aid of the cavalry, a ford was found which was good enough for the emergency. The men could just keep their arms and shoulders above the water, so that the weapons were kept dry. I posted cavalry at intervals in the stream to break the force of the current. The enemy were terrified at the sudden sight of us, and so the army was brought safely across. In the fields we found grain, and a good supply of cattle, enough for the army's needs. I then began to march toward the country of the Senones. Labienus on the Seine. Defeat of Vercingetorix's cavalry. While all this was happening on my sector of the front, Labienus, after leaving behind at Agedincum the new draft of recruits from Italy to guard the baggage, had set out with 4 legions for Paris, a town that is built on an island in the Seine. When the enemy heard of his arrival, large numbers of troops assembled from the neighboring states. The supreme command was given to an Aulercan called Camulogenus, who, though an extremely old man, was honored with this appointment because of his great knowledge and experience of warfare. He took up a position in a place where he had observed that there was a long chain of marshes which drained into the Seine, and made the whole area almost impassable. Here he stood with the intention of preventing our men from crossing. Labienus first tried, under cover of mantlets, to lay a foundation of hurdles and earth, and so build a causeway across the marsh. Finding this too difficult, he marched quietly out of camp soon after midnight, and reached Metiosedum, travelling by the same route as that on which he had come. Metiosedum is a town of the Senones, built, like Paris, on an island in the Seine. Here Labienus seized about 50 boats, quickly lashed them together to form a bridge, and sent his soldiers across to the island. Most of the townspeople had been called up for the war, and the remainder were panic-stricken by the unexpectedness of the operation, so that Labienus occupied the town without meeting with any resistance. He rebuilt the bridge which the enemy had broken down a few days before, and led his army across, and began to march down the Seine toward Paris. When the enemy heard the news from fugitives from Metiosedum, they ordered Paris to be set on fire, and all its bridges destroyed. They then moved forward from the marsh to the banks of the Seine, and took up a position facing Labienus and in front of Paris. It was known by this time that I had withdrawn from Gergovia, and now rumours kept on arriving of the revolt of the Aedui and of the successful course of the rebellion in Gaul. Gauls who got into conversation with our own native troops assured them that I had been prevented from crossing the Loire, and had been forced by famine to fall back on the province. And the Bellovaci, who had already made up their own minds to revolt, now that they heard of the rising among the Aedui, began quite openly to mobilize their forces and prepare for war. The situation had completely changed, and Labienus realized that he would have to alter all his plans accordingly. What he had to do now was to think not of further conquests or victories in the field, but of how he could get his army back intact to Agedincum. As it stood, he was threatened on one side by the Bellovaci, who were supposed to be the toughest troops in Gaul, and on the other by Camologinus, with a well-equipped army ready to go into action immediately. Moreover, he was on the wrong side of a large river, which cut his legions off from their baggage and reserves. With all these difficulties suddenly arising at once, he saw that his only hope lay in courage and in resolution. Toward evening he called a council of war, at which he impressed upon his officers the importance of carrying out his instructions carefully and efficiently. Each of the boats which he had brought down from Metiosedum was put in charge of a Roman knight, with orders to start about 10:30 p.m. and move quietly downstream to a place about 4 miles off, where they were to wait for him. He left to guard the camp the 5 cohorts which he considered would be least reliable in action, and he ordered the other 5 cohorts of the same legion to set out about midnight and to march upstream with all the baggage, making as much noise as they could. He also got together some small boats and sent them in the same direction, with instructions to make a lot of splashing with the oars. Soon afterward he set out himself with 3 legions, and marched toward the place where he had ordered the other boats to put in. Enemy patrols were posted along the banks, but a great storm had got up, and they were taken completely by surprise and overwhelmed by Labienus's men as soon as they arrived. The legions and the cavalry were quickly ferried across the river under the supervision of the Roman knights in charge of the operation. Thus, soon after dawn, and almost simultaneously, the enemy received the following reports: that there was much more noise than usual in the Roman camp, that a large column was marching upstream, that the noise of oars could be heard in the same direction, and that rather lower downstream troops were being ferried across the river. On receiving these reports, the enemy believed that the legions were crossing the river in 3 places, that they were demoralized by the revolt of the Aedui and preparing for flight. They therefore divided their own forces also into 3. 1 detachment was left to keep a watch on our camp. A small force was sent in the direction of Metiosedum, with orders to advance upstream as far as the boats had gone. The rest of their army was led out against Labienus. By dawn, all 3 legions had been brought across, and now the enemy's army came into sight. Labienus addressed the troops, telling them to remember their own traditions of courage and all the great successes they had won, and he asked them to imagine that I myself, under whose leadership they had so often defeated the enemy, was there in person to watch them. Then he gave the signal for the attack. The 2 lines came together. On the right wing, where the 7th Legion was posted, the enemy were forced back and routed. On the left, which was held by the 12th Legion, the first ranks of the enemy were broken to pieces by our javelin fire, but the rest of them stood firm and fought back fiercely, not a single man looking as though he were ever going to give in. Camulogenus himself, the enemy commander-in-chief, was there in person to encourage his men. So the issue still hung in the balance. But when the officers of the 7th Legion heard what was happening on the left wing, they brought their men around in the enemy's rear and charged. Not even then did one of them give way. They were surrounded and cut down, Camulogenus sharing the same fate as the rest. The detachment that had been left on guard opposite Labienus's camp, when they heard that battle had been joined, marched to the help of their own people and occupied a hill, but could not hold out there against the attacks of our victorious troops. They too joined in the flight of their comrades, and all who failed to reach shelter in the woods or mountains were cut down by our cavalry. When the operation was completed, Labienus returned to Agedincum, where the baggage of the whole army had been left. From there he marched on with all his forces and joined up again with me. As the revolt of the Aedui became known, the war spread. They sent deputations all over the country. They did everything they could, using every advantage they possessed in influence, prestige, and money, to bring the other tribes in on their side. They had gained control of the hostages whom I had left in their keeping, and by threatening to take measures against them, they were able to intimidate those who hesitated to join them. The Aedui invited Vercingetorix to come to them and to concert plans for the conduct of the war. He agreed to do so, and they then demanded that they should be given the supreme command. This claim was contested, and a general council of the whole of Gaul was summoned to meet at Bibracte. People came to this meeting in crowds from all over the country, and when the question of the command was put to a general vote, the assembly unanimously agreed that Vercingetorix should remain commander-in-chief. The Remi, Lingones, and Treveri did not attend this council. The Remi and Lingones because they remained faithful to their alliance with us. The Treveri because they were too far away and were threatened by the Germans, which indeed was why they took no part at all in the war, and did not send help to either side. The Aedui were bitterly disappointed by the rejection of their claim to the leadership. They saw with sorrow that their fortunes had changed, and, remembering the special privileges which I had given them, began to feel their loss. However, they had undertaken to fight, and did not care to dissociate themselves from the rest. But those two hopeful young men, Eporedorix and Viridomarus, were far from pleased at having to take their orders from Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix himself demanded that hostages should be sent to him from the remaining tribes, and named a day by which they were to be delivered. The whole cavalry force, 15,000 in number, was ordered to concentrate at Bibracte. He said that he did not want any more infantry than he had before, because he was not going to run the risk of fighting a pitched battle. Instead, since he was so strong in cavalry, it would be perfectly easy, he thought, to prevent us from getting grain or forage, only provided that the Gauls themselves would agree to destroy their own stores and set fire to their barns, in the knowledge that by sacrificing their private property, they would be winning for themselves freedom and power forever. After making these decisions, Vercingetorix ordered the Aedui and the Segusiadae, who live on the frontiers of our province, to supply 10,000 infantry. He strengthened this force by the addition of 800 cavalry, put the brother of Eporedorix in command of it, and instructed him to invade the country of the Allobroges. He opened another front by sending the Gabali and the clans of the Arverni living next to them against the Helvi, and also sending out the Rutini and the Cadurci to devastate the country belonging to the Volci Arecomici. In spite of the offensive he was launching against them, he also sent messengers and deputations secretly to the Allobroges, trying to win them over in the hope that they were still hostile to us and had not forgotten the last war. He attempted to bribe their leaders and promised that the Allobrogian state should take over the whole of the Roman province. To meet all these attacks, a holding force of 22 cohorts, raised from the province itself, had been got together by Lucius Caesar, the general whom I had left in command there. These cohorts were sent out to meet the enemy at all threatened points. The Helvi, on their own initiative, offered battle to the enemy from over the border, and were defeated. Their chief, Gaius Valerius Donataurus, the son of Caburus, was among those killed. After this they were forced back into their towns and fortified places. The Allobroges posted numerous detachments of troops all along the Rhone, and showing both energy and efficiency, protected their frontier from invasion. I knew myself that the enemy was superior to me in cavalry, and realized that, with all roads blocked, there was no chance of getting reinforcements, either from Italy or from the province. I therefore sent to those German states on the other side of the Rhine that I had subdued in previous years, and got them to send me cavalry, and the light infantry who are trained to fight in conjunction with the cavalry. When they arrived, I found that their horses were unsuitable, and therefore I mounted these Germans on horses which I requisitioned from my officers and other Roman knights, and re-enlisted veterans. Meanwhile, the enemy had been concentrating into one place the cavalry force which had been raised from the whole of Gaul, and their army which had been operating in the country of the Arverni. Great numbers of cavalry had assembled already, and while we were marching along the frontier of the Lingones toward the country of the Sequani, so as to be in a better position to defend the province, Vercingetorix established his forces in 3 camps about 10 miles away from us. He summoned his cavalry commanders to a council of war, and informed them that the hour of victory had arrived. "The Romans," he said, "are leaving Gaul in full flight toward the province. So far as securing our liberty for the moment is concerned, I think we have done enough already. But to be sure of peace and quiet for the future, we have still done too little. As it is, they will come back again with a larger army, and go on with the war. Let us, therefore, attack them now, while they are marching in column and are handicapped by all their baggage. If their infantry halts in an effort to protect the column as a whole, then they will be unable to continue their march. If, as is more likely to happen, they abandon the baggage and think first of how to save themselves, then they will suffer the loss not only of necessary supplies, but of the reputation which they have built up. As for the Roman cavalry, you yourselves ought to feel perfectly certain that not a man of them will dare to leave the shelter of the column, and to give you all the more confidence, I propose to have all our infantry formed up in battle order in front of the camp, so as to make the enemy more frightened still." The cavalry commanders received this speech with loud applause, and shouted out that they should all swear a most solemn oath that not one of them who failed to ride twice through the enemy's column should be allowed in the future to enter his home, or to approach his children, his parents, or his wife. This proposal was adopted, and everyone swore the oath. Next day they divided their cavalry into 3 sections, 2 of which appeared in battle order on our flanks, while the third began to impede our march at the head of the column. When I was told what was happening, I divided my cavalry also into 3 sections, and ordered them to go into action against the enemy. At one and the same moment fighting broke out all along the column. The column itself halted, and the legions formed a square with the baggage inside. Wherever I saw our cavalry in any difficulty or distress, I would order infantry detachments to move forward and to form lines of battle. This had the effect both of checking the enemy's pursuit and of giving our men the support and encouragement to enable them to stand firm. Finally, the German cavalry on our right succeeded in getting to the top of a ridge from which they dislodged some of the enemy, who fled right down to the river where Vercingetorix had taken up his position with the infantry. The Germans followed after the fugitives and killed quite a number of them, and the rest, seeing what had happened, began to fear that they would be surrounded, and took to flight. They were slaughtered on every side. 3 aedui of the highest rank were taken prisoner and brought to me. Cotus, their cavalry commander, who had had the dispute with Convictor Litovus at the last election, Cavarilus, who had taken command of the Aeduan infantry after Litovicus had deserted us, and Eporedorix, who, before I arrived in Gaul, had been the Aeduan commander in their war against the Sequani. The Siege of Alasia. With all his cavalry routed, Vercingetorix withdrew his troops from their positions in front of the camps, and at once began to march to Alasia, a town of the Mandubii, ordering the baggage to be packed at once and brought after him. I had our own baggage taken to a hill nearby, and, leaving 2 legions to guard it, spent the rest of the day in pursuing the enemy. We killed about 3,000 of their rear guard. Next day we encamped near Alasia. I made a careful examination of the position where this town was situated. The Gauls were thoroughly upset by the defeat of their cavalry, in which they were used to putting more faith than in anything else. I told my troops that the hard work I demanded from them would be worthwhile, and began to build lines of investment around Alasia. The actual fortress of Alasia was on the top of a very high hill, and appeared to be impregnable except by blockade. Rivers flowed along the bottom of the hill on 2 sides. In front of the town there was a plain about 3 miles long. Everywhere else it was closely surrounded by hills, which were about the same height as that on which the town itself stood. The whole of the eastern slope of the hill below the town wall was filled with Gallic troops, who had fortified their camp with a ditch and a 6-foot wall. The lines of circumvallation, which we were now starting to build, had a perimeter of nearly 10 miles. 8 camps were constructed at suitable points along the lines, and in the fortifications which linked them together, 23 redoubts were built. These redoubts were manned during the daytime by patrols in order to guard against any sudden attempt at breaking out from the town. At night they were held by strong detachments of troops with sentries always on the watch. After we had started on our siege works, a cavalry engagement took place in the 3-mile stretch of plain which, as already mentioned, lay between the hills. It was a fiercely fought battle on both sides. When I saw that our men were having the worst of it, I sent up the Germans in support, and drew up the legions in front of the enemy's camp, so as to forestall any sudden move that might be made by their infantry. But our men, feeling that they had the legions behind them, recovered their confidence. The enemy were put to flight, and in trying to escape, they were handicapped by their own numbers, and got wedged together in the gateways, which had been made too narrow. The Germans went after them fiercely, right up to their fortifications. There was a great slaughter. Some of them abandoned their horses and tried to get across the ditch on foot and climb up the wall. I then ordered the legions posted in front of their camp to move forward a little, and the result was that the Gauls inside the fortifications became just as terrified as the rest. They thought that we were on the point of launching a general assault, and shouted out their call to arms. Some rushed panic-stricken into the town, and Vercingetorix ordered the gates to be shut so that the camp would not be left unguarded. Great numbers of the enemy had been killed, and many horses had been captured before the Germans withdrew. Vercingetorix now decided to send all his cavalry away by night, before we could complete the circle of our fortifications. Before they left, he told them that each man was to go back to his tribe and summon to the war every man there was who was capable of bearing arms. He reminded them of what they owed him. It was now up to them, he said, to see that he was saved, and not, after all that he had done for the freedom of Gaul, betrayed and handed over to his enemies to be tortured. He pointed out that if they failed to act with resolution, 80,000 picked men would perish with him. He informed them that, according to his calculations, he had enough grain to last, if it were strictly rationed, for 30 days, and that by using the very greatest economy he might even be able to hold out a little longer. After giving them these instructions, he sent the cavalry away quietly just before midnight through a part of our lines where the work had not yet been begun. He then issued an order that all grain in the town must be brought in to him. Disobedience to this order would be punished by death. To each man he distributed his share of the cattle, great numbers of which had been driven in by the Mandubii, but the grain was rationed out in small quantities at a time. All the troops which had been posted outside the town were now withdrawn inside. So, while waiting for the relief forces from Gaul, he prepared to carry on the war. Prisoners and deserters informed me of what his plans were, and I began to build further entrenchments. I dug a trench 20 feet across. The sides were perpendicular, so that it was just as wide at the bottom as at the top. All the other siege works were set back about 650 yards behind this trench. This was because our lines had necessarily to cover a very large area, and the whole circuit could scarcely be manned by a continuous chain of troops. I therefore wanted to guard against any sudden night attack that the enemy might launch en masse against our fortifications, and I also wanted to prevent them from shooting during the day at our men when they were at work. Behind the 650-yard interval I dug 2 trenches, 15 feet broad, and of the same depth, all the way around. The one nearer the town ran across ground that was level with or below the level of the plain, and I had it filled with water diverted from the river. Behind the trenches, a rampart with palisades 12 feet high was erected. This was strengthened by a breastwork with battlements. Below this, at the point where it joined the rampart, large forked branches projected outward to prevent the enemy from climbing up. Towers were erected at intervals of about 130 yards all around the whole circuit of fortifications. While these great works were being built, it was constantly necessary to send men out to get timber and provisions, and as they had to go some distance away from our camp, our forces on duty were often below strength, and the Gauls would sometimes try to interrupt our work by making sorties from several of their own gates at once, and attacking us with the utmost vigour. I therefore decided to make further additions to our fortifications, so that our lines could be defended by a smaller number of men. Tree trunks or very stout branches were cut down, and the ends were stripped of bark and sharpened. Long trenches 5 feet deep were dug, and into these the stakes were sunk and fastened at the bottom, so that they could not be torn up, while the top part projected above the surface. There were 5 rows of them in each trench, fastened and interlaced together in such a way that anyone who got among them would impale himself on the sharp points. The soldiers called them tombstones. In front of these, arranged in diagonal lines forming a 5-sided arrangement, we dug pits 3 feet deep and tapering downward toward the bottom. Smooth stakes as thick as a man's thigh, hardened by fire and with sharp points, were fixed in these pits, and set so as not to project more than about 3 inches from the ground. To keep them firmly in place, the earth was trodden down hard to a depth of 1 foot, and the rest of the pit was filled with twigs and brushwood, so as to conceal the trap. These traps were set in groups, each of which contained 8 rows 3 feet apart. The men called them lilies, from their resemblance to that flower. In front of these was another defensive device. Blocks of wood, a foot long, with iron hooks fixed in them, were buried underneath the surface and thickly scattered all over the area. They were called spurs by the soldiers. When these defences were completed, I constructed another line of fortifications of the same kind, but this time facing the other way, against the enemy from outside. These additional fortifications had a circuit of 13 miles, and were built along the most level ground where building was possible. My aim here was to make sure that, however large a force came against us, our garrisons in the entrenchments could not be surrounded. And to avoid having to leave camp on dangerous expeditions, I ordered each man to provide himself with enough grain and fodder to last for 30 days. While all this was going on at Alasia, the tribal chiefs of the Gauls met in council. Instead of calling up, as Vercingetorix had proposed, every single man who could bear arms, they decided to demand from each state a fixed quota of men. They feared that if Vercingetorix's plan were adopted, such large numbers would be herded together that it would be difficult to preserve discipline, to keep the various contingents separate, and to arrange for adequate supplies. The numbers of troops to be produced by the various tribes were as follows: the Aedui with their dependents, the Segusiavi, Ambivareti, Aulerci, Branovicis, Banovii, 35,000. The Arverni with their dependents, the Eleutiti, Cadurci, Caballe, Valavii, 35,000. The Sequani, Senones, Baturigis, Santones, Ruteni, and Carnutes, 12,000 each. The Belovaci and Lemovicis, 10,000 each. The Pictones, Turoni, Parisi, Helveti, 8,000 each. The Suesiones, Ambiani, Mediomatrici, Petrocori, Nervi, Morini, Nitiobrigis, Aulerci Chinomani, 5,000 each. The Atrabates, 4,000, the Veliocases, Lexovii, Aulerci Ibirovicis, 3,000 each. The Rauraki and Boi, 1,000 each. The Amorican tribes living on the Atlantic coast, that is, the Kyriosolites, Redones, Ambibarii, Calites, Osismi, Veneti, Lemovicis, and Veneli, 30,000 altogether. Out of all these tribal contingents, the Belovaci did not send their full quota. They said that they proposed to make war on the Romans on their own account and in their own way, and were not going to take orders from anyone else. However, in response to a personal request from Commius, and out of regard for their friendship to him, they did send 2,000 men to join the rest. I have already mentioned how reliable and useful I had found Commius during the British campaign 3 years previously. In regard for what he had done for me, I had directed that his tribe should be given back its independence and be exempt from taxation, and I had put the Morini under his protection. Now, however, the whole of Gaul was absolutely unanimous in its determination to gain her freedom and win back her former prestige in war. No Gaul was influenced now by former kindnesses or the memories of friendship. Every one of them put his whole heart and strength into the war. When 8,000 cavalry and about 250,000 infantry had been raised, the whole army was reviewed in the country of the Aedui, and its numbers checked. Officers were appointed, and the supreme command was entrusted to Commius the Atrebatian, the 2 Aeduans, Viridomarus and Eporedorix, and an Arvernian, Vercassavalaunus, who was a cousin of Vercingetorix. A council of representatives from the other states was attached to these supreme commanders in order to advise them on the conduct of the campaign. They all set out for Alasia in the highest spirits and full of confidence. Every man among them thought that the mere sight of their enormous host would prove too much for us, especially as we were to be attacked from 2 directions at once, and would have to face a sortie from the Gauls inside Alasia, just at the moment when outside the town the huge mass of cavalry and infantry of their relief force came into view. The besieged in Alasia, however, knew nothing of what was going on in the country of the Aedui. The day had passed on which they had expected to be relieved. They had used up all their grain, and now they called a council of war to discuss what must happen to them next. Various views were expressed. Some were in favor of surrender. Others were for trying to break out while they still had their strength. The speech made by Critognatus deserves, I think, to be remembered because of its extraordinary and, indeed, appalling cruelty. Critognatus was an Arvernian of noble birth, and a man held in great esteem by his people. He spoke as follows: I shall say nothing at all about the views of those who recommend surrender, by which they mean slavery and disgrace. In my opinion, such people should not be considered as fellow citizens, and should not be sitting in this council. My concern is simply with those who are in favor of making a sortie. It appears that you all agree that this plan of theirs shows that we have not forgotten our ancient courage. But it is weakness, not courage, to be unable to endure want for a short time. It is easier to find men who will voluntarily risk death than men who will bear suffering in patience. Certainly, I respect the opinions of those in favor of a sortie, and I might agree with them if I considered that this was merely a question of losing our own lives. But in making our decision, we should be thinking of Gaul as a whole, and of all those whom we have summoned to our relief. Suppose 80,000 of us are killed on the spot here. What sort of spirit will our friends and kinsmen have if they are forced to fight things out practically over our dead bodies? No, they are risking their lives to save you, and you must not deprive them of the help you can give them. Do not, by your folly, recklessness, or weakness, ruin all Gaul and bring her into perpetual slavery. Do you doubt your faith and their resolution simply because they have not arrived on the appointed day? If so, what do you think the Romans are doing? Are they working day after day on those outer entrenchments just to amuse themselves? No doubt every way of approach to you is blocked, and you cannot receive the assurances you would like to have from our friends outside. But what you can do is to take the Romans as witnesses to the fact that relief is coming, since it is in terror of just this thing that they are working day and night on their fortifications. What then do I advise? I advise that we should do what our ancestors did in the war against the Cimbri and the Teutons, a much less important struggle than this one. When they were forced into the towns and threatened, as we are, with starvation, they did not surrender to the enemy. Instead, they kept themselves alive by eating the flesh of those who were too old or too young to fight. And even if we had no precedent for doing this, I should still think that now, fighting as we are for our liberty, it would be a most splendid thing for us to establish such a precedent, and to hand down the memory of it to our descendants. Indeed, there is no comparison between the two wars. The Cimbri certainly devastated Gaul, and did much harm to us. But in the end they moved out, and went off to other countries, leaving us free to live on our own lands in accordance with our own laws and customs. The Romans, as we know, have different aims altogether. It is envy which inspires them. They have heard of our glory and of our power in war, and so they want to settle on our land and in our towns, and to fasten upon us forever the yoke of servitude. The Romans have never waged wars for any other reason, and if you do not know how they behave in distant countries, all you have to do is to look at that part of Gaul which is on our frontiers, and which has been reduced to a province. You will observe that laws and institutions have been changed, and that the whole country cowers in perpetual slavery beneath the rods and axes of Roman officials. After discussion, it was decided that all those who were too old or too young or too ill to fight should be expelled from the town, that they would not adopt the proposal of Critognatus until they had tried everything else first, but that if it should prove necessary, and if reinforcements failed to arrive, they would follow his plan rather than surrender or submit to terms. The Mandubii, who had received them into their town, were now compelled to leave with their wives and children. When they came up to our entrenchments, they tearfully begged the soldiers to take them as slaves and give them something to eat. But I had guards posted all along the rampart with orders to see that they were not allowed inside our lines. Meanwhile, the whole Gallic relief force under Commius and the other commanders arrived before Alasia, and took up a position on a hill outside our entrenchments and not more than a mile away from them. Next day they brought all their cavalry out of camp. It filled the plain, which, it will be remembered, was 3 miles long. Their infantry was posted a little farther back on some rising ground. From the town of Alasia there was a view all over the plain, and at the sight of these reinforcements, all the people in the town, happy and excited, crowded together, congratulating each other on what they saw. Then they brought all their forces out and halted with them in front of the town. They filled up the nearest trench with hurdles and earth, and got themselves ready to face all the risks and obstacles involved in breaking through our lines. I had all my infantry posted along both the inner and outer lines of fortifications, so that, if need arose, every man would know where he ought to be and hold on there. I ordered the cavalry to ride out of camp and engage the enemy. There was a good view down from all the camps along the surrounding ridges, and the whole army was watching the battle intently to see which way it would go. The Gauls had archers and light infantry scattered about among their cavalry. Their duty was to check the attacks of our horsemen and to help their own people if they had to fall back. These tactics took our men by surprise, and some of us were wounded and had to withdraw from the battle. The Gauls, seeing our men hard-pressed by superior numbers, felt sure that their own forces were getting the better of things. There were shouts and yells coming from all sides, both from the besieged and from those who had come to relieve them, as they cheered their men on. And as the battle was being fought in full view of everyone, so that every brave deed could be seen and no act of cowardice could be hidden, the men on each side were impelled both by the desire for glory and the fear of disgrace to fight to the uttermost of their strength. The battle raged from midday until almost sunset, and still the issue was in doubt. Then the Germans massed all their squadrons together and made a charge which broke through the Gauls. Once they were broken, the archers were surrounded and killed, and from every other part of the plain our cavalry swept forward and chased the fleeing enemy right up to their camp without giving them a chance of rallying. At this the troops who had come out from Alasia went sadly back again into the town. They had now almost given up hope of winning. There was a day's interval, and this time was used by the Gauls in preparing great quantities of hurdles, scaling ladders, and grappling hooks. Then at midnight the relieving forces set out in silence from their camp, and came up to our fortifications in the plain. Suddenly they raised a shout so that the besieged inside the town should know that they were there, and then they began to throw their hurdles into the trenches and to drive our men off the rampart with slings, arrows, and stones. In fact, they had everything organized for a regular assault. At the same moment, as soon as the noise of shouting was heard, Vercingetorix sounded the trumpet and led his men out of the town. Our men, as on previous days, went each to his proper place along the entrenchments, and kept the Gauls off with slings, large stones, bullets, and stakes which were placed ready at intervals along the rampart. It was too dark to see far, and there were a number of casualties on both sides. A number of missiles were discharged by our artillery. Then Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius, the generals in charge of the defense of this sector, brought up men from the more distant redoubts, and used them to reinforce any point at which they saw we were hard-pressed. As long as the Gauls were at a certain remove from our lines of defence, they had more of an advantage because of the vast quantity of missiles which they discharged. But when they came in closer, they were caught on the spurs before they knew where they were, or fell into the pits and impaled themselves, or were killed by the siege spears shot at them from the rampart and the towers. All along their line they suffered many casualties, but at no point did they break through our defences. When it was nearly dawn, fearing that we might attack them on their exposed flank by breaking out from our camps on the heights, they fell back and retired to their original position. As to the Gauls from Alasia itself, they brought out all the equipment that had been prepared by Vercingetorix for the sortie, and they filled up the trenches that were nearest to them. But they took up too much time over these operations, and before they even got near our main defences, they heard that their fellow countrymen had retired. So they went back again into the town without having achieved anything. The Gauls had now been twice defeated, and had suffered heavy losses each time. They held a council to decide what they should do next, and by calling in men who knew the district well, learned about the position and the state of the defences of our camps on the higher ground. On the north of Alasia there was a hill which had such a wide circumference that we had not been able to include it in the circle of our defences. We had had to build our camp there on a slight slope on ground that could not be considered favourable to us. This camp was held by 2 legions under the command of the generals Gaius Autistius Reginus and Gaius Caninius Rebilus. After sending out scouts to reconnoitre this position, the enemy commanders chose out of their whole force 60,000 men from the states that had the greatest military reputation, secretly decided upon their objectives and their plan of action, and fixed the hour of noon as the moment for launching the attack. This force was to be led by the Arvernian Vercassivellaunus, one of their 4 supreme commanders, and a relative of Vercingetorix. He left camp soon after sunset, and had almost completed his march before the sun rose. He concealed his troops in the shelter of the hill, and told them to rest there after their night's work. When he saw that it was almost midday, he began to move toward that camp of ours which I have already described. At the same moment the Gallic cavalry advanced toward our entrenchments in the plain, and the rest of their army appeared drawn up for action in front of their camp. From the citadel of Alasia, Vercingetorix could see his countrymen going into action. He now led his own forces out of the town, bringing with him the hurdles, poles, mantlets, grappling hooks, and all the rest of the equipment that had been prepared for the sortie. Simultaneous attacks were made all along our lines, and every sort of method was used by the Gauls, who were quick to concentrate at any point where the defence seemed likely to crack. Our men, strung out over such a huge area of fortification, did not find it easy to meet these attacks coming from so many different quarters. Another thing which had a most disturbing effect on them was the noise of shouting which they could hear behind them as they were fighting. This made them realize that their own safety depended on the courage that others might or might not show. It is indeed generally the case that people are much more frightened of what they cannot see than of what they can. I found a good place from which to see what was happening all along the line, and sent up reinforcements to sectors where our men were in difficulties. Both sides realized that this was the critical moment, the moment that called for a supreme effort. The Gauls knew that for them everything was lost unless they could break through our lines. The Romans saw in front of them, if they could only stand firm, the end of all their labours. Our difficulties were greatest at the fortifications on the hill where, as already mentioned, Vercassivellaunus had been sent. Here the unfavourable downward slope was a factor which told heavily against us. Some of the enemy hurled javelins down on us, while others advanced with locked shields in tortoise formation, and all the time fresh troops were ready to replace those who were exhausted. The whole Gallic force heaped earth up against the fortifications, thus making it possible for them to climb the rampart, at the same time covering all the traps which we had hidden in the ground. Our men's supply of weapons was running short, and their strength, too, was beginning to fail them. Seeing what the position was, and how distressed they were, I sent Labienus with 6 cohorts to their relief. I told him that if he found it impossible to hold the position, he must regroup the cohorts and fight his way out. But he must not do this unless it was absolutely necessary. I myself went to visit other sectors of the line, urging the men to fight on and not give in, and telling them that everything they had won in former battles was now at stake and depended on this day and on this hour. The Gauls, attacking our inner lines, gave up hope of being able to break through in the direction of the plain. Our defence works were on too big a scale. They now attempted to storm through our lines on the higher and more broken ground, and brought up all their equipment to these points. The defenders were driven from the towers by a hail of weapons. The enemy then proceeded to fill up the trenches with hurdles and earth, and to tear down the rampart and breastwork with their grappling hooks. First I sent young Brutus to the threatened spot with some cohorts, then the general Gaius Fabius with some more. And finally, as the fighting grew fiercer still, I led up fresh troops myself to the relief. When the position was restored and the enemy driven back, I hurried to the sector where I had sent Labienus. I withdrew 4 cohorts from the nearest redoubt and ordered some of the cavalry to follow me, while other detachments were instructed to ride around the outer lines and attack the enemy in the rear. Meanwhile, Labienus had found that neither rampart nor trench had been able to hold up the furious attacks of the enemy. Fortunately, he had been able to collect together 11 cohorts from the nearest redoubts. He now sent messengers to me to tell me what he thought should be done. I hurried on so as to be able to take part in the action. The enemy could see that I was coming because of the scarlet cloak which I always wore to mark me out in action, and as the lower slopes along which I came were visible from the higher ground, they could also see the squadrons of cavalry and the cohorts which I had ordered to follow me. So the enemy rushed into battle. The shout was raised on both sides and was taken up by an answering shout from the men on the ramparts and along the whole line of entrenchments. Our men dispensed with javelins and got to work with their swords. Suddenly the Gauls saw our cavalry coming in from the rear. Fresh cohorts of infantry were also bearing down. The enemy turned and ran. As they ran, the cavalry were upon them. There was a great slaughter. Sedulius, the commander and chief of the Lemovices, was killed. The Cassivelaunus, the Arvernian, was taken prisoner in the rout. 74 Gallic war standards were brought in to me. Out of all that great army, very few got safely back to camp. From the town the Gauls saw the rout and slaughter of their countrymen, and abandoning all hope of relief, withdrew their troops from our fortifications. There was an immediate flight, too, from the Gallic camp as soon as the news of the battle was received. Indeed, if our soldiers had not been exhausted by the hard work they had done all through the day and the constant calls that had been made on them to reinforce threatened points, the entire enemy army could have been destroyed. As it was, our cavalry, which I sent out about midnight, caught up with their rear guard and killed and captured great numbers of them. The rest fled to the various states from which they had come. On the following day, Vercingetorix called a council. He pointed out that he had undertaken this campaign, not for any reasons of his own, but for the sake of the liberty of them all. And now, he said, I must yield to fortune. I hand myself over to you to deal with as you think best. You can either win the favor of the Romans by putting me to death, or you can surrender me to them alive." A deputation was sent to me to discuss these matters. I ordered all arms to be surrendered, and the chiefs of the tribes to be brought before me. I had a seat placed for me on the fortifications in front of the camp, and here the chieftains were led to me. Vercingetorix was surrendered, and the arms were handed over. I kept back the Aeduan and Arvernian prisoners, since I hoped to use them in order to win back the loyalty of their tribes. All the other prisoners were distributed as booty among the whole army, each man getting 1 Gaul. When this business was settled, I set out for the country of the Aedui, and received the submission of the state. While I was there, the Arverni sent a deputation promising to obey any orders I might give. I told them to produce a large number of hostages. Then the legions were sent into winter quarters. I had, meanwhile, restored some 20,000 prisoners to the Aedui and the Arverni. I ordered Titus Labienus with 2 legions and some cavalry to set off for the country of the Sequani, and gave him Sempronius Rutillus as second in command. I stationed the generals Gaius, Fabius, and Lucius Minucius Bacillus with 2 legions in the country of the Remi, to see to it that they suffered no harm from their neighbours, the Bellovaci. Gaius Antistius Reginus was sent into the country of the Ambavariti, Titus Sextius to the Bituriges, Gaius Caninius Rabilis to the Ruteni, each with 1 legion. I stationed Quintus Tullius Cicero and Publius Sulpicius at Cabellonum and Matisco, Aeduan towns near the Seon, to look after the grain supply. I myself decided to spend the winter at Bibracte. When my dispatches describing this year's campaign were published in Rome, a public thanksgiving of 20 days was decreed.